I don't know why I just recently discovered that, like, I don't know why I didn't realize that you could stream directly on Facebook through Zoom. I guess I just assumed that you recorded it and posted it, but then people were saying that you do it live. So I'm sitting there trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, not everyone is brave enough to join the actual Zoom meeting. So for those that want to participate just online, it ends up being a good alternative. That's why we post it live too.
Smart.
Adina's got her multicolored notes, which is always awesome.
I didn't know I wasn't on mute, like looking through my drawers.
Wait, that's so great. You keep colored coded notes. I love that.
No, my notes are so bad. Like, no one can read this.
That looked like calligraphy. I don't know
No.
what you.
Yeah, I can guarantee it looks a lot better than what I write. So,
It looks like I was too lazy to write my words properly.
I should show you my notes. Well, I don't have any in front of me, unfortunately. I just realized my notes are in here for now. Um, Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa halul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli rabbi zidni ilma. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and send peace and blessings upon our final messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Special dua, I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give me clarity in speech and eloquence in thought and the other way around. In discussing today's topics, because the part of the story we're getting into today oftentimes is something that's either rushed through really, really quickly or given much more emphasis than it really needs. And of course, what I'm referring to is like one of the major incidents that takes place in the life of Yusuf alayhi salam, which will be when the woman whose house he was living in tries to seduce him. So we're not going to mince on that at all. We can actually discuss that topic today. Um, so and I think it deserves to be discussed. And that's one of the things I actually wanted to open up with is this is our fifth time together, alhamdulillah. And some of you, I've gotten the comment before of like, you've taken like the first week we took an hour introducing the story. The second week we took an hour not even getting into the story. We talked about the first three verses. The next week we took an hour talking about one conversation, which is three ayat in here. It's like spending a lot of time on each single verse. I kid you not that we could easily have spent 5 hours on each verse, and we wouldn't exhaust its meanings. And that's many of the things that stories in the Quran are actually meant to do for us, is introduce us to topics so that we're familiar with them or we process them externally. It's this idea of, without getting too much into Jungian psychology, but it's this idea of archetypes, or that societies have archetypal stories that they keep telling each other, because within archetypal stories are major principles that are necessary for a human being to develop appropriately. So when we think about that, we think about stories such as, again, in our society, overcoming major obstacles. That's like every movie or every plot ever. Rags to riches, that's a typical story that's told. Sibling rivalry, typical story that's told. Romantic comedy or romance that shouldn't have taken place, that's another story that's told that we hear all about. And my one of the arguments for why Surah Yusuf deserves a much more in-depth study is because Surah Yusuf contains within it all of these tropes all in one. Like, we're going to do this towards the very end of our study together. I actually left 1 week behind, 1 week after we finished the whole story, like all of the ayats, in order to just discuss what some of these tropes are that we've identified. And the whole point of this series is, as we go through this life of Yusuf alayhi salam, we start understanding our own stories as well. That components of every single verse are actually not just happening in the past, not just did they happen in the past, they're going to happen in our future and are happening in our rooms right now. Last week, when I talked about the brothers negotiating with their father and like trying to emotionally manipulate him, um, I can't tell you how many living rooms that happens to every night, in every night, where people are, again, going through these tough family conversations. We're not supposed to read it and be like, oh, that happened. It's like, no, this is happening right now. And in it are lessons for me. And we also said, remember, Allah didn't just say that there's lessons in Yusuf. It was Yusuf and his brothers, which also comes down to everyone in this story there's lessons of. Like I said, the second week we were together, I'm like, some of us might be Yusuf alayhi salam or Yaqub, others of us might be the brothers. And it's good to identify yourself as the villain from time to time. Because in that there's massive lessons as well. And I say the same thing about the conversations that are about to take place in today's lesson. Some of us, we need to ask ourselves, who are we in this story? So with that, I'll get to the ayat for today. We're going to go through ayats 20 through 24. I actually liked how we did it last week, where instead of me reciting the entire ayat beforehand, I'm just going to go through ayah by ayah, and we'll talk about themes and topics that come up. And I wanted to pick up from, I know we covered ayah 20 last week, but we had to rush through it because that's how time somehow works um, with us every single week, alhamdulillah. But when we got to ayah number 20, I had to really rush it, but I wanted to focus on kind of like some of the consequences that come from what this verse is bringing up. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَشَرَوْهُ بِثَمَنٍ بَخْسٍ دَرَاهِمْ مَعْدُودَةٍ وَكَانُوا فِيهِ مِنَ الزَّاهِدِينَ. And they sold him for a low price, a small number of silver coins, and they attached no value to him. Today I put both the Abdul Halim translation and the Picathal translation. Picathal has a very literal translation, which is awesome, but he also has the idea of like oftentimes saying like, lo, he hath, and that type of terminology, which I call like awesome translation language. But it's a very literal translation, so I prefer it for that reason. Last week we talked about how this group of people who picked up Yusuf Islam, where it is in his story, we can literally count the number of scenes in our hands right now. Boy sees dream, tells his father. Father tells him, again, not to tell his brothers. Brothers conspire amongst themselves. That's the second conversation. So there's like the hero conversation. There's the villain conversation. Brothers convince dad to go take him. Brothers take Yusuf, and they have thrown him in a well. They go back to their father. That was scene 5. Now this is scene 6. Group of people from a caravan, a bunch of poor people find him. Why do we know they're poor? They're like the water boy goes and gets him, and they hide him right away, and they take him. And Allah then captures and makes commentary that they sold him for a tiny price, and they didn't value him at all. I've actually been really thinking about this ayah. Last week we talked about the horrors of slavery, right? And like this idea that you see an entire human being, and what you get from it is I can make money off of them. Like it's such a gross way of kind of appreciating a person, or depreciating a person more accurately. And like it's this disgusting place. But actually what I was thinking about a lot, and part of this is actually based, this is going to sound a bit weird, but I've been thinking about Surah Yusuf a lot throughout the week, and I actually had a dream this morning in which weirdly enough, I felt like I was watching like almost like an auction go on of people. And I remember thinking in my dream right away, this is like Surah Yusuf, except it was in a very futuristic society. Part of it probably has to do because I'm watching Star Wars Clone Wars with my family. So that's probably where this is coming from, where the imagery at least is coming from. But I remember thinking right away, that's Yusuf, alayhi salam. And this idea of like people being valued as just a means to profit. And such a disgusting way that we live in a world that this still happens. Look at all this technological advancement around us, but it's still happening. But then actually the interesting thing was then suddenly someone rose up, and then people started bowing down to that person. And I was like, oh, this is creepy. Like it went from one extreme to the next extreme. And that actually made me think about this story a lot, because when we think about the Yusuf alayhi salam's trajectory, he goes from slave to basically king. But he's a righteous king. But where does Egypt go? Egypt goes from extreme materialism to worshiping their king. It almost seemed like two opposite extremes to me, where it goes from what people are just a means of what benefit, worldly material benefit, to a person is God. That's what happens with Pharaoh. Because keep in mind, the idea of Pharaoh doesn't exist in Egypt yet. And actually, historically, we have this confirmed as well. The original pharaohs were not actually inheritors of God or gods on earth. They weren't. They were just kind of practically people who had order around. But then they eventually became like gods. And I would actually make that argument that the pharaoh we have in the Qur'an, the next corrective figure that comes after Yusuf is actually Musa. Musa alayhi salam has to remove the tyranny of Pharaoh. When Yusuf alayhi salam had to remove the tyranny of this almost like weird material, like people killing each other for the sake of their own rising. And Allah provided prophethood as a solution. And I started actually thinking that those are two extremes that you can have. You can elevate a human to deity status, or you can downgrade a human being to the status of what? Something that's worthless. And the correct, I think one of the ways I was looking at is prophethood and the idea of revelation from God keeps us balanced between those, not elevating anyone more than they need to be, but also still maintaining people's humanity. Just thought it was like an interesting thing where Allah says, and a few pieces of silver, that was it. They didn't give him any value. Of course, this is also putting forward the idea of Yusuf Islam is eventually going to be the one who literally saves the country that he's being bought in for what? Just a few pieces of silver. They didn't really realize what they had here. And that's how we're supposed to really understand that you don't know what any one person is worth. You can never treat someone like this. Never sell someone off for just a few dirhams, for just a few likes on social media, for just whatever the benefit will be. It's never going to encapsulate it enough. So I just thought there was an interesting thing. I wish we had gotten to last week. That's why I wanted to start this week. What do you guys think?
I think you can draw parallels to today, and we're pretty materialistic in America here. So I wonder what's going to happen in the future.
I wonder if it goes the complete way, and this is something we can unfortunately see, is materialism sometimes leads to idolatry, not just of money itself, but also people who have it. So that could be a pathway to it as well. So Allah captures that. Allah keeps putting forward of like, look, they sold him for nothing. We know how much he was actually worth. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gets right into the person who bought him. And here I also want to appreciate that when it says they sold him, yes, it was the ones who picked him up, but there's also this idea, think about the narrative of Yusuf alayhi salam, of when they sold him, it didn't just happen once. From Canaan, which we don't have the detail of where Yusuf alayhi salam and Yaqub, his father, lived, that we get through biblical narration. But it's pretty far away from Egypt. So it's probably he was sold from one market to the next, to the next, to the next, until he finally made it to like this elite market, which is from Misr. Misr would be a major empire. So you don't just end up from like a random little country farmland area to the city without there being a lot of transactions in between. But Yusuf alayhi salam, Allah puts all of it together, all of that was just for a few pieces of silver. And we can imagine what was happening to this kid throughout this whole process. There is this idea of being dehumanized because bought and sold. But actually, a lot of what we're going to see today is that doesn't seem to be what happens to Yusuf alayhi salam. What seems to be happening is Allah keeps telling him, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but that we gave him hikman wa ilman. We gave him wisdom and we gave him knowledge. There's like the people thought they were benefiting off of Yusuf, but Yusuf was the one benefiting off of them. Out of all of these interactions he's having, what are people doing? They're like, aha, I made a profit. Aha, I made a profit. I've worked him. Aha. Like they think they're getting ahead, but Allah will tell us actually it was Yusuf was benefiting from all of this, this entire time. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then it says when eventually وَقَالَ الَّذِي اشْتَرَاهُ مِن مِصْرِ, and the person from Egypt who bought him, I'm going to pause just to give us a bit of a translation. That's a weird way of calling someone the person from Egypt, but that's done for a couple of purposes. One is that Allah doesn't want to introduce the character completely just yet. All we need to know is he's from Misr, who's like a giant empire versus some random farmland. Also, because it seems to suggest that he has some sort of position, because normally, like a normal person, you don't call them of another country. Like, when I'm introduced somewhere, I'm not like Kaiser from the United States. Like that doesn't happen. That happens if you're like a senator, or that happens if you're a governor, or like something like that. Not just a random dude. It's like, oh yeah, he happens to live in New Jersey, so let's make him the representative of the country. That doesn't happen. It's only introduced that way if they have some sort of special position. But that's, and a whole country is mentioned, so he's got some degree of importance. That's also kind of mentioning, to me, the way I see it, is the importance that Yusuf alayhi salam seems to have taken on. Is he was noticed by who? You think someone who has this high of a position, someone who like is representative of an entire country, is going to buy someone who's like just like going to push a cart around or something? No, like he must have really built himself up in order to kind of impress someone of this stature to get him. And even more so, he says to his wife, limra'atihi, technically translated, he says to his woman, but we'll get into why it doesn't say zawji, who, it actually says imra'atihi. He says to his, for our purposes, wife, but not in a very good relationship. Akrimihi mathwahu, make his stay comfortable. Not just make his way stay. It would be that would be like akrimi baytahu. That would be make his house comfortable. But mathwahu is thawa is a place that you stay for generations on end. Like if you buy something and you want your kids to inherit that house after you, that would be a mathwa, right? Allah will use this to describe Jannah. That Jannah is going to be the mathwa. So he's saying like, hey, he's going to stay here a really, really long time. Maybe he's even going to have a family here. So keep him in a great place, like honor, and not just that, but honor him, because it's like he's not going to be the typical riffraff we have. He's not going to be a typical servant that we have. This person is going to be special. Makes you think probably because he saw all of this already within Yusuf alayhi salam, this amazing character. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues, and I'm not going to get through the whole ayah, I'll just get through this portion of it. Asa an yanfa'ana aw nattakhidahu walada. Maybe he'll benefit us in some way, or maybe we'll even adopt him as a son. How much did this servant or slave like impress this person, in which he's just like, hey, keep him. We're going to keep him for a really long time. I've already made the decision that we're keeping him for a very long time. But if things keep going well, we might even take him as a son. That's an interesting thing to say, and I actually have to appreciate this woman is going to come up very soon in today's 2 ayat later. Like this woman's going to come up, but some of the things I see of this is also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wouldn't capture this detail that he says this just to his wife for no reason. This is the way he treats him in public and private is both good. Like you and I have both, all of us have come in interaction with people who they treat you amazing, like in private, but then when someone else comes in, they treat you like you're worthless. That's not how this person's treating him. This person seems to be telling Yusuf Isam, you've got awesome stuff, so that's why I'm going to treat you well. And he's also telling his wife, hey, treat him well. So there seems to be like genuine appreciation of who Yusuf alayhi salam is. His manners must have been impeccable. His skill set must have been impeccable. And we're going to eventually get into his looks, of course, are impressive as well. Like that's going to be a component of this, but he's got this charisma to him that makes everyone around him just really, really appreciate him.
Is that do you think that's like that's a good, like that's good on the part of the person who bought him, or is it just because Yusuf alayhi salam was just that amazing, or both?
So probably both. The character of Potiphar, that's his name in the Bible. In the Qur'an, he's eventually going to be called Aziz, right? So I'm going to use his Quranic name, which is Aziz, which is more of a title, which is like governor. Different interpreters of the surah have different kind of opinions towards him. Some actually have the opinion that no, he was actually a really good guy. I personally don't have that opinion, because at the end of the day, he did buy Yusuf and he does agree to eventually throw him into prison, right? So like, but we can say he has good qualities. In this story, we're going to find over and over again that even good characters, quote unquote, have flaws, and even flawed characters have good qualities associated with them, because this is a very human story. And that's the way I actually like presenting him, is he's got good qualities. Like he's competent, but I wouldn't call him good.
Okay. I was just thinking, because you know, like from my understanding, Yusuf alayhi salam like wanted to go to prison, right?
Yeah.
So maybe he just, so maybe like maybe it's just the case that, you know, he thought it was also the best thing for him.
It could very well be. I can see that being being where this is where like our scholars have went both ways in terms of saying like, no, he was a good guy versus he was not that great of a person. Um, I think the only thing that the Quran definitely understands is he was a really good politician and he did his job well.
That
I
makes
have
sense.
another thought
Mhm.
that this man that buys Yusuf alayhi salam, he basically, all the value that he never got from his brothers is the value that he's getting from this stranger who buys him and tells him basically like, I might even adopt you. I'm going to treat you like you're a part of my home. He didn't even get that courtesy from his brothers. So it's kind of an interesting parallel where it's like it's like a prime example of if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes something away from you, it's because there's something else that he's going to give you in return, and this was kind of like the stepping stones towards that.
SubhanAllah, I didn't think about that. What I did think about though is we're gonna find something interesting. Yusuf alayhi salam, it seems to become beloved to anyone who has a degree of accountability towards him. What I mean by that is like he sees a young servant. This is another thing that uh, if you saw a young person whose talents haven't been taken on yet, typically a mentor wants to take them on. Why? Because you can help develop them, right? And there's also like a disgusting transaction associated with this as well of like they're probably being undervalued. Why? Because they don't know their talent yet. If someone who knows that they're talented, suddenly like they know what they're talented, so there's a degree of arrogance. But someone who doesn't, there's humility, and you can kind of develop this trait onto them. Anytime Yusuf alayhi salam uh, anytime someone who has this degree of kind of like ownership of Yusuf alayhi salam, whether that be a father or some the person who bought him, they seem to really appreciate him. But someone who is almost equal to him feels jealous of him, and we're actually going to see that with his wife eventually. That was what Yusuf alayhi salam experienced with too, his brothers as well. It's almost as if horizontal relationships share jealousy, vertical relationships share I don't know what the term is to look at, but they seem to kind of really appreciate him. Moise asked an interesting question. I find it a little weird that he is bringing up adoption. Does it mean his wife is infertile? Allahu alam. I've actually heard that before in kind of tafsir, but I don't think there's any confirmation of whether that's true or not. But there's no siblings mentioned or no kids mentioned in the household, so that could be a possibility. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then continues, وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. And this is how we established Yusuf on the earth. وَلِيُعَلِّمَهُ مِنْ تَأْوِيلِ الْأَحَادِيثِ. And we taught him the interpretation of, I know the translation says of dreams. I'm going to say of all events because we talked about this before. Ahadith is more the true meaning of things. And isn't it like, you have to just appreciate for a second what this kid has already been through at such a young age. Farming, his father was a prophet. So again, a host of knowledge that comes from his father being a prophet and giving him the narrative of his grandfather who was a prophet, his great grandfather who was a prophet. He learned about betrayal at a very young age from his own siblings. He was sold into slavery for a number of years, probably. So he's learned how to live on the streets. And now he's being put in the house of a politician. And that politician really likes him. Meaning, like, I'm going to call it, like, if we use today's terminology, he's an intern for a governor. Can you imagine all the conversations that are going on in the house of Aziz? He's probably taking on the role of like assistant in some way. He's probably taking on the role of Okay. My apologies about that. So he's probably taking on the role of assistant in some way. He's probably taking on the role of kind of learning the trade from him. He's teaching him, this is how I fulfill my responsibilities. This is how all of this happens. So he's getting all of that. And also he's hearing the double speak from people. Because think about it, in a house of politicians, sometimes people say one thing and they mean something else, right? Even the politician themselves. Sometimes what happens, they have a press conference, and then when it's time to come home, we catch people with hot mics all the time. We catch people with hot mics all the time, where like a politician, when they thought the camera was off but it was actually on, they said something in secret. Yusuf alayhi salam is privy to all of that. So when Allah says we taught him, this is how we established him on the earth, this is how we taught him the true meanings of things, this is what's really being referred to here, where Allah is literally teaching him, this is like giving him all of that knowledge and all of that experience that normal people don't really get. And the way I also have to look at it is like, anytime we find ourselves in positions in life, we have to ask ourselves, like, what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaching me in this moment? Like, what proficiency am I supposed to be gaining? Not just from the times when it looks like we have an awesome job or something, but even when you didn't get the awesome job and you missed the bus and you had to walk 3 blocks and this, like, Allah is preparing me for the role that Allah has planned for me. Just like Allah is doing this for Yusuf, and Allah continues, Wallahu ghalibun ala amrihi, and Allah was completely in control of all of this happening. Walakinna akthara an-nasi la ya'lamun, except most people weren't aware. And that's for all of us, is for us to recognize that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts us in a weird scenario, a compromised scenario at times, the key question we need to ask is, what's Allah preparing me for? What was I supposed to learn from this? We're going to get that even more in the next ayah, where Allah will take a break from the story and comment on just what Yusuf alayhi salam was kind of gaining in the next couple of years, or in these moments of his life.
I think that's really interesting and beautiful because even when you're in a compromised situation, you rarely think that you're being established, right? You think the opposite, that you think you're being you think you're not firmly grounded at all. But it's interesting how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns it around.
Yeah, definitely. It's like some of his darkest moments, and this is the second time this is being said. The first time was when he was in the well, right? So in the well, and even here, this is how we established Yusuf on the earth. And here we're like, yes, he's actually being established. We're going to fight it again when he ends up in prison. But how Allah changes things, because you eventually do have a role to play. That Allah was, and the term that's being used here is ghalib. And that's interesting too. In this surah, we're going to have 2 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned. Ghalib ala amrihi, and latif is the other word. Ghalib is Ghalib was the overpowering, and then latif will be the subtle. The one who kind of, through just tiny actions, little signs, little directions here and there, will completely change things. Isra, go ahead.
I have a question. Could the well that Yusuf alayhi salam was thrown in be a sort of metaphor for the things that come later in some way? I don't know what, like, I can't exactly articulate where my mind is going with this, but if you're thrown into a well, you're thrown into this deep underground dark place, right? Kind of reminds me of I'm blanking right now, but it kind of reminds me of like other stories of the prophet. They're stuck in this dark place, and I forget who mentioned it before, but it feels like you're not grounded, but you really are, ironically, because you're literally in the ground, right? And so I don't know if I have a particular point, but I feel like it could be tied. Like the well is the beginning of the story, but it could be something that's a metaphor for the entire story in and of itself, where he ends up being pulled out of the well anyway.
So there's going to be so many parallels here, because the well, there's so many metaphors of or relations to. This is the equivalent of Musa alayhi salam being thrown in the river. This is the equivalent of Yunus going into the whale. This is the equivalent of Abraham being thrown in a fire.
Yeah.
This is do you see my point? Like how many times prophets go through something? This is the prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam being thrown out of Ta'if. Right?
Yeah,
like
and
a really dark moment where his brethren cast him out.
And I'm kind of thinking, like you said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him knowledge, and his father was a prophet, so he understood this concept already. So yeah, that was my thought.
Yeah. And ways that's an intelligent thing to say. A cave is a horizontal well. So yes, the Ashab al-Kahf as well. I guess we could toss into this. But this happens over and over again. And it is a very, very common kind of trope within prophethood. And we would also say this is a common trope within any narrative in any of our lives too, when that unexpected turn takes place. And Allah will actually get into how do you use that productively. Allah will talk about that in the very next ayah. Any other reflections or thoughts before we move on to ayah number 22?
I have one. You can go.
Okay. I was going to say that I think that this ayah is implying that Prophet Yusuf's impact, when it says, Asa an yanfa'ana, maybe he could benefit us, isn't just him and his wife, but rather all of Egypt. And then how you said maswa wasn't just for like right now, it's for generations and generations. Maybe that the benefit of this really like kind of small thing that this person is doing by helping a slave has generational impact because of the places Prophet Yusuf will go, and that even eventually sets up the stage for Prophet Musa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a viewpoint, and there are scholars that looked at the character of Aziz and said Allah wouldn't give him such a good title if he wasn't like a good character. And he says he recognized that Egypt's on its last legs unless we infuse it with good qualities from the outside. So that's what he's actually referring to. So that's a very astute observation, Adina. And I think there's some truth to that. He might be doing double speak, because a lot of people in this story do that, where they recognize like, subhanAllah, this kid's talented. I don't want to limit him. So he takes him on and says it'll be benefit for all of us. So he's thinking altruistically, not just for himself. I personally we'll get into why I'm more of the opinion of he was looking out for number one, but if it helps everyone, great. That seems to be more of the approach here. But I can see that. And of course, that's what Yusuf Islam will actually bring this whole land. And for each of us, that's supposed to be, that's something we can see of, don't just think of yourself at times as Yusuf alayhi salam. Think of yourself, how many times in life do you have the ability of like mentoring someone? And you don't know how much of a benefit that person can be to the whole, like literally the entire system you live in. Because he could have decided to like, I'm not having a good day today. Forget this slave.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So if this man is like you said, a mentor, so to speak, to Yusuf alayhi salam, is there does he receive reward for being a means of him reaching his place as a leader eventually? Like, is that like a possibility? I don't know. Like, I used to even ask my mom this when it came to quote not so good people, or like people who challenge the prophets, or people who are just a part of the prophets' lives. These people are the reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed these people in the prophets' lives for a reason. Do they receive some type of benefit or reward for playing that role, assuming that it's a beneficial role, not a detrimental role?
We have a narration that says that Abu Lahab, the day the prophet was born, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Abu Lahab is a terrible character. If we're talking about villains in the Qur'an, like he's up there number 2 or number 1. Like he's like, there's a surah named after him for how terrible he is. But the day that the mention of the Prophet ﷺ was given to him, he freed the slave that told him the news out of happiness. And there's a narration that says that his punishment will be reduced for a certain for one day a year or something like that because of that. So there seems to be the suggestion that yes, no deed that you ever do will go without its reward.
Okay.
Chaplain, may I interject something? Firstly, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
So secondly, you've mentioned this before, but I think it's really interesting how we see Yusuf alayhi salam being, how he learns all the different kinds of intelligences, ranging from street intelligence to obviously emotional intelligence. I mean, that's through the roof here. And then just intelligence even in general. So he's had the chance to be amongst people that are immersed in poverty, people that aren't so poor, and people that are, more opulent. And he's seen those problems. And it reminded me of this article I had to read for this class. Well, it wasn't for a class, but it was for a lab that revolves around political psychology, which is very applicable here. So that article basically talked about how no matter how much the world changes, we're going to need to know how to build and maintain relationships, and we're going to need to focus on communication. So we can see Yusuf alayhi salam knowing how to interact with people on a lot of different bases. And he always finds some way to connect somehow. He doesn't make it about himself, but he makes it about the person, which we'll see later on, with the dreams, for example, that he connects it back to them, which is another thing that I've noticed. People love to talk about themselves. They don't really care about what we have to say. So I find that really interesting that Yusuf alayhi salam was gaining knowledge that just was beyond academic intelligence.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's going to be found in the very next ayah as well, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues talking about Yusuf Islam. وَلَمَّا بَلَغَ أَشُدَّهُ آتَيْنَاهُ حُكْمًا وَعِلْمًا وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And finally, when he, because walamma is used, so walamma, anytime that's found in the Qur'an, that's code word for like it took a long time to get to this. And finally, when he reached, I'm going to use very, very literal language here. When he reached a severe state, all right? I'll get into why I'm translating that soon. We gave him, God gave him wisdom and knowledge. And this is how we pay back those that do, those who are excellent. That's going to be my translation. I know it looks very different than the translation you see in front of you. First, I'll go through kind of literally what's being said here is, terrible analogy, but just stay with me here. This is, in my opinion, the Qur'an's version of, how many of you remember the Hakuna Matata song in Lion King?
Yep.
Simba's doing that weird this thing, right? And he goes from being a kid to being an adult. All right. This is this. Insert a much cooler version for any other coming to age montage. And that's what this ayah is really capturing. All right. I use the lamest one ever, but just insert that. That's what's occurring here. And what does balagha ashuddahu mean? Balagha is like age generally or maturity, but ashuddahu is like a severe. It comes from actually shadid, right? Because you can actually see the root word of sheen dal dal is actually found there because of the shadda on the dal. It's kind of interesting. Shadda, shadid. That's okay. It's actually the same word being used twice too. That's where shadda even comes from. Is from shadid to emphasize something or to make something more. But it's this idea when everything was at its height. And different people have argued, what age does this mean? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will use the term balagha ashuddahu arba'ina sana in the Quran, when you reach the age of maturity at the age of 40, right? Though most opinions are this is way before 40 for Yusuf alayhi salam. And I think that actually has to do with different people reach this age at different ages. Like, but honestly, what it is. The reason they say most of the time that that's 40 is because most people don't achieve wisdom until way later on in life. That they need to go through periods of what's the term I'm looking for? Of like they need to make mistakes and then learn from their mistakes. Sometimes they need to repent and then they finally reach maturity. What Allah SWT seems to suggest about Yusuf Islam is he actually reached that way earlier than most people. That's why balagha ashuddahu. Typically, it's understood that he's in his early 20s at this stage. And it's not just talking about physical maturity. Because physical maturity, if we understand it, for most people that will actually be in their 20s, right? They say, like in our society today, at 25, you're actually at the peak physical strength that you'll ever reach. And then it's not that it's all downhill from here, but in our tradition, generally, we've said when is that age? Is in the age of 33. There's this approach that understanding that Jannah, people when they're in Jannah, they'll be at the age of 33. Why? Because that's not just when you're physically mature, but also you're intellectually mature. Even if by the age of 33 you might be physically weaker, that physical weakness, the amount you've gained in your head is way worth it. Like experiencing maybe parenthood, experiencing like having a little bit of wealth and making some mistakes with that wealth, you're typically a lot more put together. But Allah saying that this is the age that Yusuf alayhi salam reached. And Allah says, interesting about him, that he has what? That he was given wisdom and knowledge. Wisdom first, knowledge second. Allah will use this exact same phrase to describe Moses actually a couple of generations later. When he says Allah gave him this. And here's where I have to just stop and really appreciate Allah appreciates his wisdom and knowledge. Like how smart must have Yusuf alayhi salam really been? And most of us, when we think about it, is we think who are the most knowledgeable people? They're the ones who are in like Ivy League schools and like have had the best upbringing from like the moment they were born, like a silver spoon was handed to them and they got the best that education could buy. What did Yusuf alayhi salam get? He maybe got that for the first like 7 years of his life because his father, a simple man, farmer, but prophet, so he started getting a lot of cool stuff. But then what happened? Slave owner to slave owner to slave owner to the house of a politician. And not only that, but he's a slave in the house of a politician. But Allah says, no, we gave him, anytime Allah does this, it's this idea of, it's not just Allah controlled that this was happening to him, and Allah appreciates this about him. That's why Allah doesn't say he got it himself, is we gave it to him, because that's how much like wisdom and knowledge this kid is accruing. So I just got to pause there and appreciate that the whole idea of it only in like ideal environments, ideal people come out. Allah seems to flip that around completely. That in the most compromised environment, sometimes you have the most gems of human beings that you can find. And وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. This is how Allah rewards those who are excellent. This isn't supposed to just limit it to Yusuf was excellent. This is actually supposed to say that actually anyone who ever strives for excellence, Allah will give them wisdom and will give them knowledge. This gets into a problem for a lot of us though. We're like, hey, don't you need wisdom and knowledge for excellence? How is the reward for excellence wisdom and knowledge? And I think this is where we don't understand what excellence is. Excellence is about whatever you have, you make the best of it. It's not about being extraordinary. Some of you have heard me say this so many times that you're just annoyed of it at this point. But the difference between extraordinary, our society tells us to be extraordinary, meaning like stick out, be special, do something no one else has done. That's not excellence. Excellence is based on what you have, based on what you've been given. What are you able to do with it? Compete with yourself from yesterday, not from other people around you. That's excellence. And Allah says, anyone who who strives to be excellent, Allah will give them hukm. It could be translated as either authority or wisdom, and gives them ilm, knowledge of how to address a variety of scenarios.
Chaplain, I have a question. Wasn't there a hadith, perhaps Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but I don't remember, where he said that the only thing he can truly pass on is knowledge or something of that sort? I remember reading this somewhere, or it was mentioned somewhere, that knowledge is being passed on.
So, I mean, there's a bunch of narrations about things like knowledge, about knowledge being amongst the only things that can benefit you after you've died. So it's one of the 3 forms of sadaqah jariyah. I'm not familiar with the particular narration you're talking about. Anyone else heard it?
I think it might be what you just said, perhaps that knowledge is one of the few beneficial sources that can actually be continued.
Yeah.
And I was just, oh, sorry, what were you saying?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like the only 3 things in our tradition that generally are seen as your book of deeds can grow after you are physically die are righteous children, knowledge, and building a place that continues to give in charity, continues to give somehow.
I was actually going to say also, subhanAllah, I was going to mention that I like that wisdom is mentioned first, also because it tends to be overlooked in society despite being embedded in the tiniest of things all around us. But could it also be that wisdom is mentioned first to prioritize between wisdom and knowledge? They're both important, but I think wisdom is the kind of thing that books can't exactly give you.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense with Yusuf alayhi salam, right? Because I would imagine he's experientially learning. But then there's also like, it's like you're the bang for your buck. Like if you're wise, you know what to study.
Yeah, exactly. You'll know which things to prioritize and which things are perhaps for a later time or not worth your time.
Yeah. Because it could happen all the time. Like, and I think a lot of us actually go through this. I know I went through this where like I used to just read a ton of random things and then be like, I don't know if I actually learned anything. It's like, it could be I accrued a bunch of knowledge, but was it actually beneficial? So like I became dumber at the end of it. Because now when I have to think about something to say, I have to sift through so much more information in my own head to get to it.
When you went over the ayah right now, like when you're talking about how Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam attained maturity at a much younger age, I actually remembered something a friend of mine was telling me. He was saying that scholars like they generally refrain from writing commentary on hadith in their early 30s at a young age. Like they wait until they reach their 60s or 70s until they become old. And the reason being for that was because they're aware that because they're young, they're going to be prone to making more mistakes, and they wait until they reach a much older age so that they don't end up making themselves look like a fool by commenting on hadith like at a much earlier age.
One of my teachers, Dr. Irfan Ahmed Khan, may Allah grant him Jannah. I mean, he passed away a couple of years ago, but he said something interesting. He said that no one should comment on the Qur'an, and he said this kind of in joke, but it actually hit me quite a bit. He said until they have had grandchildren, and I was like, why? And he goes, because you haven't experienced the best this life has to offer yet. And I was like, that's a very astute point. He's like, how can you appreciate the truths of akhirah until you've experienced the best of dunya? I'm like, that's an interesting point to make.
I have a question about the word muhsinin. I thought that it was more of like a Hasan as good character, not excellence in like merit.
So muhsin in our tradition, it can be equated to many things. One of them is exactly what you just said, is there's this idea of like Muslim, mu'min, and muhsin. And muhsin is someone who's like so aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Actually, the definition of the Prophet ﷺ is that they when like behave as if they can see Allah, recognize that they cannot see Allah, but they are content that Allah sees them. So it's like someone who is at the top of their game all the time because they're acting as if they can see Allah. So yes, that's found, but I would argue that's the definition of excellence.
But like excellence isn't like, from what you were saying, I thought the excellence you were applying was like you're excellent in the homework you do, or you're excellent like stuff like that. You're excellent in your chores, but not excellent in like your character.
I would say excellence in character, it would be the epitome of excellence in the other things. Because someone who's truly excellent, they do the most with what they have. Meaning that like someone who's just extraordinary might win first place in a race and be super happy because they beat everyone else. But then someone who's excellent might win first place in a race and just be like having the worst day ever. And you ask them why, it's like, I ran better yesterday. They're not competing with people around them. They're competing with themselves from yesterday because they know that they could do more. That would be the idea of also character, that you treat people not based on what they deserve, but what God expects of you or how close you want to be to God. So that's also the idea of where excellence comes from, even in that spiritual sense.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Isra, I'm not sure if your hand is raised from before.
Yeah. I lowered it and then I had to raise it again because I was like, I need to, okay. But it's funny, subhanAllah, because every reading that I do in my ethics class, it somehow aligns with what we're talking about in this class. So one of the articles we had to read was about this theory of virtue and how there's two different types of virtue, and there's your intellectual virtue and there's your character virtue, right? And how do you develop the two? Your character virtue is developed based off of good habits and how you do those habits and how you implement those habits. And we were talking about ihsan, I think last week or the week before, right? The way in which you do something and the excellence of that. And so This article basically analyzes how in order for us to actually, regardless of our nature and nurture, we have the capacity to shape our character through our habits based off of our own decision-making process, right? So it completely isolates the idea of nature and nurture and it makes it about you. And how small, consistent habits, subhanAllah, because that's what we are encouraged to do in Islam, are the most effective ways of improving your character and the person that you are. And the author basically said that that's what leads to a good life. And so it just reminded me of that, because that's the entire, like, it's these people, we spent so much time talking about this in an ethics course, and that's exactly what we're taught in Islam from day one. Small, consistent behaviors, actions that build a habit to develop good character. And if you develop this strong character, you have an easier time making decisions that are difficult because you build up this strength and this foundation. So another article related to it for that class talked about how if you build this strength and you build these habits, you basically expend less energy when you're making a difficult decision.
SubhanAllah. Yeah, that's very true, because you have more of the tools to kind of deal with it. And I'm not talking about the tools of like knowledge. You have the emotional and the bandwidth to deal with it. Wow. SubhanAllah. So much to be said here, and this is an ayah that's supposed to give us so much motivation, to the point where like some of us think, if only I had a good teacher, if only I had, insert whatever you want right here, right? I was born in a house that spoke 3 languages. My parents would have told me to memorize Qur'an when I was younger. I've not that I've ever used that excuse ever, but like there's so many things that we could say of if only. But actually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like, if there was anyone who had an if only, it was Yusuf alayhi salam. But Allah rewards Yusuf alayhi salam, and anyone who like him does what? Goes for excellence. Regardless of their circumstance, they use their circumstance to actually attain wisdom and attain knowledge. And Allah says, you be excellent, I will increase you in it. That seems to be the contract with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here. You aim for excellence. Excellence doesn't mean you know more than everyone else. It means you do the best with what you have, and Allah will give you hukman wa ilman. Allah will continue to push you towards it. But on the other front here, not that this is contrary to that point, the very next ayah, Allah's praising Yusuf alayhi salam, but if he has a good quality, guess what? It's going to get tested right away. What happens? The next ayah is about him being seduced. If we're talking about him having amazing character, amazing intelligence, amazing emotional maturity, amazing spirituality, because that's oftentimes where Muhsin is understood as. It's like this extremely spiritual being. Well, it's about to be tried. In the very next ayah, وراودته التي هو في بيتها. Another strange way of introducing someone. And the woman whose house he was living in seduced him عن نفسه, for herself. وغلقت الأبواب وقالت هيت لك. And she locked all of the doors and she said, هيت لك, come. So immediately after talking about how awesome Yusuf alayhi salam is, he's got amazing qualities. Again, it takes you to the other ayah of, did you think that you have iman and expect that we wouldn't test it? That like, what's going to be the proof that it's going to have to be used? This is the other side of, this isn't a be careful what you wish for a moment. This isn't that. But this is to understand that we actually are supposed to use the talents Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us. That if Allah gave you a talent of being mature, are you using it or are you not? And one of the ways that it's going to be used is going to be tested. One of my teachers used to tell me that if you don't use what you have for a really big good, Allah will test you with it. That like you get to choose your test. You either get to use it in the cause of Allah or you'll be tested because of it. So this is like, if Allah has given you wealth, better use it for something good, or what, you might get tested in your wealth. If Allah gifted you with a great personality, use it, or it might be a source of a test for you later on. So it's this idea that takes place right away. Yusuf Islam has this amazing maturity, physical maturity, emotional maturity, wisdom, so much awesomeness. And the example we get of, oh, by the way, this is what happens when you have awesome stuff. It gets tested. The woman whose house he was living. Here, I'm going to make some commentary on the ayah itself before we get into some of the lessons. It's a weird way of calling her out. Again, she wasn't talked about as wife, Zawj, because in our tradition, Zawj is reserved. The status of wife or status of like, Zawj just means a spouse, is reserved for those who have good marriages. That like when you're fulfilling your end of the bargain, then you're called Zawj. In this case, that's not what's found. It's the التي هو في بيتها, the woman in the house that he was living in. Because one thing is Allah's not dignifying her with the status of being a spouse because she's not behaving in a way a spouse would behave. I'm not going to go too in depth with this, but I will just say one of the necessities of being a good spouse is by protecting your honor and protecting intimacy to be something that you especially experience with your spouse. This woman's not doing that, so she doesn't get dignified with the status of Zawj. It's one of the requirements of what a Zawj is supposed to be. They're supposed to be ones that maintain each other's best qualities and cover up each other's faults. Woman's not doing that. There's a lot of issues kind of going on, so she doesn't get called by a term other than just that woman, that lady. So that's going to be one kind of component. And then you have to ask yourself, like, why would something like this happen? Allah already introduced early on that when he said to his woman, he didn't say to his wife. There seemed to be something that was deteriorating for a while here. And I don't know how else to say this other than like Yusuf alayhi salam's maturity, Yusuf alayhi salam's kind of probably ability to take on all of these qualities that she maybe doesn't see in her husband leads partly to this trial. And the comment I want to just make on that is more along the lines of what's the term I'm looking for here? It's more like marriages take generally speaking, a marriage doesn't just break apart in an instant. Oftentimes it was something that was leading up from time to time to time. And we got hints of that in the surah when Allah said how he referred to his wife. There was like this weird brokenness in their conversation. There was this idea of Allah calling her an imra rather than a zawj. Like there was already signs of it going on. That just matured over the years till it eventually led to a moment like this. It didn't just happen like right away. And again, part of that lesson is supposed to be, we're supposed to try to fix any errors before it leads to something this drastic ever taking place, because it doesn't just pop out of nowhere. That's the first kind of comment I'm going to make here. Well, and I want to hear from you guys kind of what are some of your reflections. We'll get to Yusuf alayhi salam's response in just a second.
Just a quick thing. It's you were talking about her not, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just calling her the woman, or it's almost interesting that like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the woman, the one whose house he was living in, like it has like, so you have to like specify. So I just thought that was like a really interesting, like it's like at this point, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is really not honoring her as like as a spouse.
There's that, but that also tells Yusuf, tells the audience how little power Yusuf alayhi salam had in the scenario, right? Because it's like, oh, she had all the power. Why? Because it was her house. Like he was in charge of everyone. So like she engineered the scenario. Like it was taking guilt away from Yusuf alayhi salam.
I also think that this speaks to just the precedent that's set about behavior like this for anybody that's actually reading the Qur'an, because we live in a society where this type of behavior is actually very, very prevalent, right? And it's something that like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically showing us how disliked it is, but how anybody can end up in just a bad situation. and what are you supposed to do when you're in a bad situation, right? Like sometimes people will say you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not always intentional, but that's how it works out. What do you do when you're in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Yeah, that's a very good point. This is going to be the example. And why Allah will bring this story up is this happens this isn't like something that just happened. This happens all the time. And that's actually captured with warawadathu. Allah starts it, interjects, then says, وَغَلَّغَتِ الْأَبْوَابَ وَقَالَتْ حَيْتَ لَكَ. She's been seducing him for a long time. Rawadat is this idea of like ensnaring someone little by little by little, like trying to pull them in. This would be like always trying to get into inappropriate conversations, always trying to like get him to spend time with her alone. To like this has been happening for a while, and Yusuf Islam is not having it. So finally, she gets desperate and goes, locks all the doors and says, "Now, we're doing this." Like again, this didn't just play out overnight. It took a while to kind of get there. And the reason I also mentioned that is, especially in these scenarios, it's weird. I hate using the slippery slope argument on a normal basis, but this is actually a place where the slippery slope argument is completely valid, where you get worn down over time. And Allah actually in this surah is teaching us what you do in the first instance, but also in the last instance. And what's captured is what you do in the last instance, because that becomes almost like the extreme scenario of it. When someone's trying to have an inappropriate relationship with you and they're willing to go through whatever means necessary to get it.
I found it kind of cool that, not cool, but like kind of unique, is that during that time, like I feel like women tend to be more attacked by men when it comes to sexual harassment and stuff, whereas the Quran is taking a flip story 1,000 years ago, defending a man who was attacked by a woman, saying that it is possible to get sexually harassed by women too. So I just found it kind of cool, but like unique.
Definitely, and I think this story can be very I don't know what term to use here other than progressive, even though I don't think it applies. But that it's a conversation, like harassment in this case is a conversation about power dynamics. That seems to be more emphasized than gender, right? That the Quran emphasizes what? Oh, he was in her house. She had control of everything. She's the one who controlled the locks, right? It's about power dynamics. That's why he was powerless, not necessarily about gender. That would actually be a very progressive talking point to this day. And that's the one example of sexual harassment that we have actually in the Quran. Yeah, it's 7:02. Can I go for 15 more minutes, inshallah? Yes. Okay.
Yes, please.
And this would be a very odd place for us to leave it. And she says haytalak. There's lots of different opinions in terms of what it means. It's actually a statement that doesn't have a meaning in Arabic. One interpretation is that she said it in Hebrew. She doesn't speak Hebrew. Yusuf alayhi salam speaks Hebrew. So this is also like she did her research to figure out what to say to get him to like. Again, there's a lot going on here. This was a complete planned thing, and the whole idea of like locked the doors. She's been planning this because all of her spontaneous things have not been working. I don't know what other like we're living in a society in which it's recognized that people with power dynamics oftentimes sexually abuse their employees or people who are under them. Right in a I hate to say but in a lived Me Too world, like this is something we see all the time. This is an example exactly of just that. And then, but we get how do you avoid something so difficult? Every excuse that possible could be given to Yusuf alayhi salam, which is what she has all the power. Allah will eventually say she desired him and he desired her. Like Allah will actually mention that. We're gonna get to it in just a second. And we could even say poor child, he's had so much trauma, right? Because isn't that true? Taken away from his family, maybe living a life of a slave. Apparently no one would find out. But Yusuf alayhi salam still responds.
Let's go.
Yusuf alayhi salam still responds, "Qala ma'adha Allah." He says, I don't like your translation of my God forbid. Ma'adha Allah will be I associate myself a'udhu, just like we say a'udhu billahi, right? I associate myself with Allah. Innahu Rabbi, he is my Lord. And I don't actually think Yusuf at the time is saying this out loud. This is more of self-talk here. At least the first part. Ma'adallah, he's saying that just to himself, like, no. Ma'adallah. Innahu Rabbi ahsana mathwaya. It's again going to be choppy statements. He is my Rabb. This is of course referring to Yusuf as-salam talking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it could also be he eventually said, my Lord, as in your husband. Ahsana mathwaya. Made an awesome, he's always been kind to me, he made my stay here awesome. Innahu la yuflihu al-zalimin. Anyone who transgresses, zalim is just injustice, will never succeed. This is as much Yusuf alayhi salam saying it to himself as he's saying it to her. A lot of statements in this surah are going to be, again, double speak, that they can be interpreted by the hearer and the person who's saying them. And in both of them, there is actual truth. This is actually what's being found here. Innahu la yuflihu zalimun. That Yusuf Islam is maybe even telling himself, anyone who cheats, anyone who does something like this, they're never going to succeed. Allah told me my father told me I'm a prophet. I'm inheriting from the legacy of the prophets. No, there's a lot more to my life to come. I could not mess up something like this. Ma'adallah. Look at what Allah's already given me. There's that happening. There's him speaking to her. We can't do this. This is going to be terrible. You have a responsibility towards my Rabb. My master is your husband. There's that's going on here as well. And this is not going to end well for anyone. Anyone who tries to cheat and tries to go for their pleasure rather than the tasks or the responsibilities that they have, they never succeed. All of this is happening at the same time. That's Yusuf alayhi salam kind of going through it. And this is really what it comes down to. Like when you're in a state of about to committing a sin, these are actually the steps you're supposed to take. Bring Allah into it. Ma'adallah. As difficult as it is to say, ma'adallah. It's a huge thing for anyone to remember, but even in a compromised position, sometimes you feel almost too dirty to say ma'adallah or a'udhu billah. But that's actually the next step. And what is it? Remember the favors that Allah gave you. What do I have to lose? Oh my gosh, Allah has given me so much. Man, all of this can be taken away from me right now. Innahu la yuflihu al-zalimun. I know it seems like doing this is going to be make me happy, but it really isn't. Because who does success come from? From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like that is the way to actually like get out of a terrible situation. And this can be as trivial as being tempted to swear, being tempted to backbite. Even the backbiting is not a trivial thing, but you get my point. Like it could be a speech, it could be you're about to look at something you're not supposed to look at, it could be someone's handed you the ability of doing a sin in that moment, you just got that text message and you are thinking about responding back, whatever the case may be. Like this is actually the response. A'udhu billah, my Lord has given me so much. Innahu Rabbi ahsana mathwaya. All of us can easily say this. And innahu la yuflihu al-zalimun. That I might think that this looks good for me, but it isn't in the long run. Like that is the response to it. And that's what gives him the strength to do what he's just about to do. And Allah will capture, وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ. And she desired him, وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَنْ رَاءَ بُرْهَانَ رَبِّي. And he would have desired her if it had not been for the clear sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what is the clear sign? The clear sign of his iman, of him being able to say ma'adallah, or the thoughts of Allah coming in his mind, he would have desired her as well. Different mufassirin have looked at this and said different things in terms of, wait, does this mean that he actually really liked her? I'm on the mindset of saying that, yes, that he was probably attracted to her. Think about it, young man, she's probably, I'm going to assume a little bit here, but I'm going to assume ancient societies that the governor didn't marry a random person. He probably married like a trophy wife type of individual. So like she's probably an attractive woman. So when it says hamma biha, it seems to be that no, and he inclined toward her lawla, but Allah immediately interrupts with lawla, if it had not been an ra'a bi burhani rabbi, if it hadn't been for the signs that Allah gave him, the iman that Allah gave him, he would have given in like right away. But Allah did give him that. So because of that, he didn't incline towards her. And Allah then finishes كذلك لنصرف عنه السوء والفحشاء. And we did this in order to keep evil and indecency away from him. إنه من عبادنا المخلصين. He was indeed amongst our sincere servants. So Allah is actually protecting Yusuf alayhi salam from any slander or anything either. That he would have fallen for this. Why? Because he's a man. He's a human being. Human beings have a tendency to, they have the ability of messing up. And he has the weaknesses that every other human being has. But Allah's iman, the iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can get you out of even the most compromising situations. And Allah says, and he did get out of it because he was amongst the mukhlisin. Maryam asked the question, do we know how old Yusuf alayhi salam was here? He was probably in his 20s. That seems to be the suggested age from, like, if you take the biblical narrative, if you take the Quranic narrative, the word balagha is used. I don't think he was like 16, 17. I think he was probably more along the ages of like early 20s.
Oh, okay. I was presuming something around 18 or 19 or something of that kind.
Yeah.
Also, one more question. So you mentioned that she was drawn to also his personality, but I had always thought it was just purely the way he looked that she was attracted to.
The reason I would say she was probably drawn to all of it is Allah captured all of it in the ayah before. Like, what did Allah say we gave Yusuf? He said we gave him physical maturity. That's what he started off with. Balagha ashudda, which is like he was at the peak of his ability, but also his wisdom, hukman, and his ilm, and his knowledge. That, like, I have no other way of saying it. Like, he was a full package. He was exactly what someone would be looking for. In terms of to be attracted to, and that this was the trial that he went through almost as it. I don't want to use it almost in terms of like this was the cost of him being given all of it, but this is the way in which all of that can be tested, and this is also the idea of Allah will test people in the way that will affect them the most. Yusuf alayhi salam, he's probably super intelligent, so if someone tried to scam him, wouldn't work. Why? He's too smart for it. Yusuf alayhi salam, if someone tried to make him angry, wouldn't work. He's too intelligent for it. Right? But what is he tested in? In that thing which is a specific test for him that will try him like no other test could try him. That's what he gets tested in. Does that make sense? And part of it is, think about how big of a test that is, because if you've lived a life of a slave, who are you generally trying to please?
Your master.
But in this case, you can't please your master because your ultimate master isn't going to be pleased if you please them. That's a tough test for someone who's known a life of slavery.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just curious because I'd always thought that she was just blinded by lust. But if you're mentioning that she was actually also somewhat attracted to his attributes as a human being, then, oh, okay, that makes sense.
I'm reminded of the story of when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's father, Abdullah, was coming. I think was going to marry the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's mother, Amina, and a lady actually, I think on the way there, correct me if I'm wrong, actually proposed to Abdullah, and then seeing that he had this sort of light coming from him. So it kind of reminds me of what you're saying, like, like people can sort of, be attracted to, immediately attracted to like good qualities. Yeah.
I think you're using the very modest language when you said she proposed to Abdullah.
I heard one from you. I heard one account from you, and I heard one account from Martin Lingsbrook, and the Martin Lings used proposed. So I just chose the more conservative language.
Yeah, proposed a very quick nikah, we could call it. Yeah. So
I
yeah,
have
that's exactly right.
maybe another. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I have maybe another example. I was driving, so maybe someone already said this, but I was thinking of, in terms of being attracted to a quality right up front, wouldn't that also be shown with Khadija and the Prophet ﷺ, right?
Mhm.
Because I remember seeing a lecture once, or maybe it was in one of our classes where, it was a Yasser Qadi lecture, and he mentioned like loving somebody before you get married is not haram because she loved the Prophet, the qualities of the Prophet, even before she met him.
Mhm.
But it's about how you act upon it. So she could be another example of having those feelings for somebody just in terms of their character and their personality traits.
That's exactly right. And I'm actually going to sort of tie your comment in here with Asim, who just posted. Can we also tie this to the
क्या
poor relationship between Aziz and his wife?
और
And
क्या मांग सकती हूँ
our spouses are
मैं देखती हूँ एफएस की साइट पे जाके
I don't know if I can mute.
क्या
There we go. Our spouses can be are supposed to be our protection from the worst parts of ourselves. And not just our spouses, but like your family in general is supposed to be that. So the example of like, can you love someone before you marry them? Yeah, the answer to that is yes. Khadija radiallahu anha loved the idea of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, loved his qualities, was almost like smitten by him, if I can use that term in a positive way. In terms of like getting shy around the idea, so had to send someone else. And when in their initial conversation as well, there seemed to be like shyness that's found within it, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but it's exactly how Isra said, how you act upon it. But this is where I'm going to also tie into what a good relationship is supposed to do. This is a much bigger lesson to take on. Is you might be attracted to someone and you're married. That can happen, but this is where if you have a good relationship with your spouse, that's supposed to allow you to control even your worst desires or worst inclinations. That part of the reason, like the presumed idea and why I've been pushing that idea of there was already a break in their marriage is if there had been a good relationship between them, this wouldn't have happened. Even if she was attracted to him, if she had a good relationship with her spouse, that relationship would be able to withstand the temptation that she was feeling. But because it was a bad relationship, it wasn't able to protect her from acting out her desires. That's the idea of why Allah SWT, one of the descriptions of marriage is libasuhum wa libasuhunna. You're their protective clothing and they're your protective clothing. You're their inner armor and they're your inner armor. So because they keep some of your worst tendencies inside. Not just they protect you from the outside, they protect your shame from getting out. Because what's going on here? Her shame is getting out. She's acting on it when she shouldn't have been. So again, Asim, I really appreciate you sharing that. The other side of this, I'm gonna just put out there. We'll wrap up with this. Kind of following that same role of this is, I think, something that I know most of you here are not married, but the way you're supposed to protect your spouse from their worst tendencies is supposed to be that, generally speaking, affairs don't happen overnight. That when in like relationship type situations or workplaces, like unfortunately we hear about this type of stuff all the time, but it doesn't just happen that like someone's happily married and then one day suddenly they decide to go and cheat on their husband or cheat on their wife. That doesn't really happen. What happens is someone called and someone lingered a little bit too long, and they started sending text messages which seemed too intimate, and then a call, and then they were alone, and then like there's a huge narrative that builds up. One of the ways that spouses are supposed to deal with that is at the moment that you feel weird, you actually tell your spouse, so that now you have a place to process it rather than hiding it and trying to process it yourself. That's how your spouse is supposed to protect you from falling into this trial, where you could talk to your spouse about it and be like, hey, does this text message sound weird to you? Someone said something strange. Should I be careful? And in that case, you bring your spouse in to help you fend off your worst tendencies and someone else's worst tendencies, rather than, unfortunately, sometimes the relationship in a husband-wife setting is so kind of already iffy that if I said this, they're going to assume I'm already doing something wrong. No, but the fact that they shared it, and this is where the spouse who's being shared this like vulnerable information needs to be super supportive, because I wouldn't tell you unless like I need your help to navigate this compromise scenario, not so that you could get mad at me. Because if the spouse who you're telling got mad, then you'd be like, I'm never sharing information like that again, so I guess I'm on my own. And when you're on your own, you're more likely to fail. This is how like spouses are supposed to protect each other. And part of what I see in the situation, her name is put forward as Zulaykha. In a lot of tafsir, that's from her biblical name. But she seems to be actually alone. And I'm not justifying her actions. That's not it. But what I am putting forward is almost an explanation as to how a situation like this could have been avoided. If we do an analysis of the situation of where she seems to find herself, Allah doesn't link those two together. They're not swimming at the same level. They're not swimming with each other. And that's part of why she fell into her temptations. The other part of this, and this will be, I know I've said this a couple of times, the last thing that I will talk about, but a component of this that I also want to get into is the idea that Zulaykha is a flawed character. This is something that's found all throughout. But then there's other interpretations of like she seeks tawbah later on. Like she repents to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and she eventually becomes a good character. Like the brothers of Yusuf, they will seek forgiveness and they will end up kind of in a better state. Not everyone is good to be around everyone at the same time. Like there are people in your life who in the moment they're bad for you, but later on, it doesn't mean that they're bad or you're bad. You're just in a weird moment in life that you shouldn't necessarily associate with them because your support systems aren't where they need to be. This is the idea of kind of like who you can and cannot interact with isn't just based on if two people are good. It's, is it a good moment for them right now in how they are and where you are with your abilities and inabilities? Is that the best time to maintain an appropriate relationship or not? And in this case, we see, no, there's a pretty terrible time. She seems to be going through a bad marriage and he's at the prime in which he would be quote unquote desirable. It's just a terrible time for them to be in an alone relationship together. So it's a compromising situation. So again, it doesn't justify quote unquote bad action. And this is the idea of we're supposed to create the approach where there are two different types of people who do quote unquote like inappropriate intimate activities or inappropriate sexual advances. There are those who are predators and there are those who are wanderers. A predator seeks out ways to put themselves in or put other people in a compromised intimate situation. A wanderer is not having their needs fulfilled. So what takes place? They fall into terrible behavior in order to get their needs fulfilled. Maybe they need companionship. Maybe they need physical intimacy, because that is actually a part of a human being. Maybe they need, whatever the case may be, they're missing it. So what happens? They're going to seek it out in inappropriate ways. We have to make the assumption that every predator started off as a wanderer. We want to set up things in society so that two things happen. A wanderer doesn't become a predator. And on the other front, we need to set up a society in which someone who is a predator gets punished and gets caught. There's a prevention of the wanderers who maybe haven't done anything. They haven't gotten to the state of predator yet. We need to set up blocks in our society so that what? They don't ever go there. Because at the end of the day, they are victims too. Doesn't excuse predatory behavior, but you can understand the predatory behavior. And if there is someone who has gotten into that realm of predator, they need to be caught and punished. Why? Because like that's inappropriate. That's just going to spread. I'm hoping that made a little bit of sense. And what I mean by someone being a wanderer would be someone being placed in a weirdly compromised scenario where like they're being overworked, they're underappreciated, they literally have no means to kind of blow off steam, and then suddenly someone comes into their life who like seems to just be available, and like they always listen, they always are like providing a smile when they're getting emotionally completely mistreated and all of this type of stuff, and that person suddenly is like, huh, maybe I can start this relationship. That's a wanderer. We need to have scenarios in what we have safeguards against wanderers, because we never want them to be turned into predators. But then if you've been a wanderer long enough, you start engineering those scenarios, and that's when that gets into the idea of quote unquote being a predator. My apologies. I saw someone unmuted themselves, and then as soon as I started talking, muted themselves again. I believe it is Hannah.
Oh yeah, so you just asked if that made sense, and I was gonna say yeah, it did.
Okay, alhamdulillah. I really appreciate that. Any questions or comments as we head towards the conclusion of today?
I just have one question, just in general. I don't think it just in general that I saw in the a pattern that I see in the Quran. Allah keeps mentioning we, and we gave him the knowledge. We did this and we did that. I'm just confused as to why Allah doesn't say I did this. Why we?
That's the royal we. So anytime you see like even a company, they make a statement, or like in the past, kings would make a statement. They don't say I because they represent an entire establishment, or they represent more than just themselves, right? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will use the term we because Allah represents the creator in all. And when the creator represents anything, it's the creation as well. So we is a term of power. There will be times in which Allah says I, but that's very, very rare, and that's to establish intimacy. Like jannati, when Allah says udkhulu jannati, right? Enter my jannah. And that's much more intimate, but normally the default is to say we, because that's the stronger position to speak with.
Makes sense. Thank you.
I have a question too, and this may be like really, really long, but you can just give like your best in the time that we have. So how does somebody get out of the wanderer mindset?
Oh, that's a really, really, really good question. So I feel terrible that I didn't address that. When someone ends up in the wanderer situation, they need to put support systems in to recognize that their needs aren't being met, and they need to do really careful analysis of like a good audit of like, am I missing companionship? Am I missing physical touch? Am I missing like what are they, and what halal opportunities has Allah given me in order to get some of that? And what I mean by that is like, if someone finds themselves like, man, no one keeps up with me. And the question is like, wait, I have friends. I have the ability of making friends. How come I don't keep up with them? Maybe companionship is what I'm missing. Sometimes it's something as simple like physical touch, of like that they mistaken a lack of like the love language of physical touch, of like shaking hands and hugs and these type of things, as like, no, I need like that's the equivalent of like almost sexual touch. And there is a need for sexual touch, but that's a different style. And that's where you need, sometimes someone needs to put forward of like, and do an audit. If I can't necessarily do that, be ready for marriage or be ready for intimacy in that romantic way, how affectionate am I to the people I am allowed to physically touch, like my family members, my friends? And I know we sometimes think that these sound like complete opposites, and to an extent they are, but this is where I'm also, without getting too into the biology, once you start being sexually intimate, then that becomes a real need for someone. But if it's not a thing in your life, it can actually be supplemented by other kind of love languages. The 5 love languages, generally speaking, are physical touch, words of affirmation, quality time, gift giving, and acts of service. And it's any relationship you're in, these are the ways that you actually maintain and build the relationship. And oftentimes when something feels inadequate, it's because it's not being expressed in one of your love languages the way you appreciate it, or you're not expressing it in the way the other person appreciates it. There's a pretty good book by Chapman called The 5 Love Languages, and now there's like 5 or 6 different variations of it. It's actually really insightful in helping anyone figure out how to repair their relationships, and also to realize like what they really value in a relationship. And that's oftentimes what needs to be done, is if someone feels like a wanderer, that like I'm seeking out weird relationships that I know I shouldn't be having, be like, oh, are my love languages being met? And when they're not, it's oftentimes because I'm not meeting other people, so I'm not getting the reciprocation.
I have a question slash curiosity because you're saying things that are very prevalent in like our age category, right? So I'm wondering, like, people who have a habit of resorting to relationships or other vices, so to speak, that they shouldn't be resorting to, and like, how does that get combated when you're trying to change that? Like for people that are not able to find somebody or be in a relationship, they resort to the internet for things, or they resort to I don't know, like other stuff, right? Alcohol or any form of substance.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of gear away from that if it's become something that's integral? Because you mentioned that once you have the experience of an intimate relationship, it becomes a necessity. But if you don't have it at all, it's not as much of a problem. So if you've already been exposed to something, how would you like backtrack that? I would imagine it would be much more difficult, but I don't think it's impossible.
Yeah. So very, very good question, and we'll wrap up with this. I'm going to try to give a soundbite answer, even though you know this, so I don't like giving soundbite answers. But anything that is, what's the term I'm looking for? Any sin or negative tendency that you're doing that you've been consistently doing is meeting one of your needs. That's the first thing that needs to be addressed. And the best way to address that is to figure out a productive way of addressing that need, or to taper down its addressing of that need so that you're no longer reliant on it. Because when something addresses our needs, and let's just call it for what it is, it turns into an addiction, whether that be psychological, whether that be behavioral, or whether that be even physiological. When it's addressing that need, suddenly you start feeling like you can't live without it. And that becomes the biggest impediment to you. Every time you try to quit, you just keep going back to it and back to it and back to it. A better way is to do an honest audit of, okay, this is the need I've identified that I'm meeting with this sin or this habit. Now, what are positive ways for me to address that need? And oftentimes what you'll find out is the positive ways or maybe aren't the best just yet. So like, okay, then how do I at least get it where this sin isn't meeting that need for me? In terms of I start controlling it rather than it controlling me. So if it's a habit or what that happens spontaneously, you start changing it into a planned habit instead. So that you gain some sort of control over it, because when it's then you have control of it, that means you can start decreasing it, both in intensity and in frequency. And once it starts being planned and you start getting some degree of control on it, then you start recognizing what's that need. And I'm being vague here on purpose. Because for some people this is bad company, for some people this is pornography, for some people this is a boyfriend girlfriend type relationship. There's a toxic friendship. There's a lot that this could really be going down to, a codependent activity that they're constantly in. So there's a lot that this could really be addressed with, but it's then tapered down so that you reduce the number of times and the intensity with which you engage. But then it also leads into eventually you replacing it with something productive that actually does meet your need appropriately. Does that make sense?
Yes, and you're right. It's so, because I see so many examples in so many different variations, so I just figured it would be relevant to this subject, to what we're talking about.
Yeah, inshallah, I think there'll be another time. There's another moment. Well, next week we're going to finish off the conversation that Yusuf alayhi salam has with Zulaykha. And kind of how he escapes from the scenario and how it actually escalates even after that. And then he has to kind of come up with his own response of like, Ya Allah, remove me from the situation. He gets removed from the situation. So we'll have more of an opportunity to discuss this inshallah next time we're together as well. Jazakallah khairan everyone. I do have to get to another meeting. for the awesome conversations today. And of course, this is just a beautiful story that hits on so many societal problems that not just we have dealt with, but we are dealing with, and we will continue to deal with until the day of judgment. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls this the best of stories. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all allow us to have the ability of taking on these lessons and understanding that these are here to teach us to better the societies that we live in, to better the families that we live in. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability of addressing our own inadequacies when we're faced with a compromised situation. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability of recognizing that each one of us is going through training to be the best version of ourselves that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to, just like Yusuf alayhi salam, that any mishap that happens, we're at the end of the day from Al-Ghalib, the one who is in control of all of our affairs, that we admit that so that we may be people who are muhsineen, who always try to strive for excellence. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.